my name is Erin Hodson, and I'm a professor and extension entomologist with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. And it's my pleasure to be able to kick off Crops TV. It's a virtual experience in December and January. Today is going to be a focus on soybean. Later next month, I'll be talking about corn rootworm, so I hope you can join me again to keep the insect conversation going. But what we've decided to do today is focus on two soybean pests, one old and one new. I'll be talking about soybean gallmidge, which is a new pest, and my colleague Ashley Dean is going to be talking about an older pest, soybean aphid. So even though this is a pre-recorded video, Ashley and I are in the background live to answer your questions. So I encourage you to open up your chat boxes, ask questions along the way. We'll try our best to answer those the best we can during the video, but there's also going to be plenty of time after our video to answer questions and have a discussion if you have interest. So let's get started. Again, I'm going to be talking about a new pest, soybean gallmidge, and it's a collaborative effort. And I wanted to acknowledge some of the other entomologists in neighboring states from Nebraska, South Dakota, and Minnesota. So there's a lot of collaboration with sharing today. Just to make sure that we're all on the same page, soybean gallmidge is a relatively new pest. There were some observations in Nebraska in 2011 of some dead and dying plants, and it slowly spread in geography, finally arriving to other states like South Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa. And the first time I heard about any type of infestation in Iowa was in northwest part of the state in 2016. It slowly spread within farms and between farms, and it wasn't really until 2018 where we had noticeable plants that were dead and dying, and it also was found in southwestern part of the state. Now, this is a new species not known to occur anywhere else in the world except for a few states, which I'll show in just a moment. And because it's a new species, it was officially described with the scientific name in 2019. This is where we are with the current distribution of soybean gallmidge in the United States. We started a detailed effort of scouting in the Midwest looking for positive detections of soybean gallmidge in 2018, which you can see in the red counties. And then 2019, or in the orange counties, we had a few more detections. And then in 2020, you can see the new counties in the yellow. So where we're at right now is we have 5 states, so that's Minnesota, South Dakota, Nebraska, Iowa, and Missouri, and a total of 114 counties. We added 19 counties in the United States this year, and if we zoom up on Iowa, there's a total of 31 counties. So all along the western edge from north to south, you'd be able to find soybean gallmidge in many of those soybean fields. If we take a look at the production value that's represented by these 114 counties, within the United States it represents 11 million acres of soybean and just under $5 billion in production value. If we, again, zoom up to Iowa, it represents about 3.7 million acres of soybean and $1.8 billion in production value. I wanted to just briefly recap what we have as our best understanding of the life cycle of soybean gallmidge. It's a question that we want to ask with any new species that is a field crop concern. Our observations looking at some of the adult emergence data, which I'll show later, shows a life cycle, egg to an adult, takes about 4 weeks, 28 to 32 days. And so I can best summarize it as this. We start off as eggs where females lay them in wounds or natural openings near the soil line of the soybean stem, so about 4 to 6 inches off the ground. The eggs will hatch and the larvae will start to feed on the inside of the soybean plant. They will go through 3 instars, and they start off small and translucent but get a little bit larger and turn darker as they mature. And the 3rd instar is most visible by the naked eye because it's bright orange and they're pretty wiggly. And so they are going to move from the inside of the plant and drop out of the plant into the soil, and that's where they'll pupate, is underneath the soil. After pupation, they'll hatch out of that pupal case and they emerge as an adult and then come above ground and look for mates and laying eggs to start the life cycle all over again. Again, it takes about a month to do this. I wanted to provide some general scouting tips for soybean gall midge in case you haven't seen it before or maybe suspect it in your area. The first thing that I would do was concentrate my scouting efforts on corn-soybean interfaces. So where corn is growing now, it was likely soybean last year in most cases. I would concentrate my scouting efforts on the first 2 to 8 rows where corn is growing this year, likely soybean was growing last year. And I would also spend more time in areas that are close to dense vegetation like tree lines, grassy waterways, fence lines, shelter belts, things like that. We tend to find more soybean gall midge in those areas that are next to vegetation. I would also concentrate on those fields that are planted earlier compared to those that were planted later. They seem to be attracted to early planted fields in our observations from 2019 and 20. And then they tend to infest early vegetatives, say 3 leaves or V3 or later. We have not found them in plants that are just emerged or have just a few trifoliates. So V3 or older plants. I wanted to show you a range of plant symptoms. After the midges have laid eggs and the larvae begin to feed, remember right above the soil line, that area around the feeding sites is going to start to turn brown and decay. And sometimes it forms in a large lesion, so the base of the stem becomes swollen, and other times it almost becomes girdled and that tissue starts to really fade away. And so I'm just showing you a range of injury here, and hopefully you'd be able to see the orange maggots that are starting to move away from the plant and drop to the soil line. So if you're looking at a plant from above, you would start to see brown wilting plants, and then if you take a closer look, you could start to see some of those feeding lesions from the larvae. I also want to provide another tip that I found this year. When you are visiting fields that are still in that vegetative stage, it's easy to see a plant that is wilting or browning and maybe looking different than others. Later on in the season, when the canopy is closed, it is more difficult to see that. So what I've been doing is just parting the canopy with my hands and listening for a crack. And so if you're used to doing the push test in corn, it's a similar but not quite as dramatic effect that you would get. Because of where the larvae are feeding, sometimes the base of the plant becomes very brittle and obviously would crack or break away from that soil line. So I would look for that in addition to some of the discoloration. So if you're still not sure if it's soybean gall midge or maybe it's a fungal pathogen, I would use a small pocket knife and split the stem open and look for maggots in addition to some of the discoloration on the inside of the stem. We spent a little bit of time trying to estimate the symptomology when it goes from a healthy green plant to a dead and dying plant, or dying and dead plant. And so what we've been able to do with some careful field observations is, say day 0, you have an adult captured likely laying eggs on that plant. It takes about a week, just over a week, before the blackened lesions start to show up because of the larval feeding. And it's about a week and a half or 12 days to when you would start to first see the orange larvae appear that most people can see with the naked eye. And it takes about 3 weeks from the initial point of that egg laying to where you could have visible signs of stress, so wilting, browning, even dead plants. So it takes about 3 weeks to go from good to pretty stressed, and sometimes a plant can die because of the feeding. I wanted to share some research updates that are going on not only at Iowa State but some collaborating neighboring states. And so the first one would be trying to understand some of the basic biology that I talked about with the life cycle. But we're also interested to learn where do they overwinter, how long does an emergence period last, and how many generations they can have per year. So one of the things that we've done, and our collaborators as well, have set up these adult emergence cages, because remember, the adults come out of the ground and they're looking for mates to lay eggs. And so we're using these soil cages put over the soil in different habitats, and as the adults come out of the ground, they get collected in these canning jars. And so we had 900 of these traps in Minnesota, Iowa, and Nebraska this year. And together we were able to collect over 4,500 adults. And so that's a lot of data that we're still trying to sift through. But some of the highlights from this summer is our first detection in Iowa was on June 12th, and it matched up very closely to what we saw last year in Iowa, which was June 14th. And it's actually very similar to what Nebraska was seeing too. This year in 2020, they caught their first midge on the 10th of June. And last year, it was just a slightly delayed on the 14th of June. So if you can think back to what growth stage your plants were at in mid-June, it's that early vegetative stage in most cases. Plants have been growing sometimes for 4 to 6 weeks. And so that's a time at which the adults are emerging, and it's a good time for them to be laying eggs on sort of those V3, V5 plants. Again, the second question we'd like to know is how long is that emergence period? So from the first midge in the cage to the last one in the cage, how long does that take? And Nebraska had some really nice data that I want to show you. And you can see in East Central Nebraska, they had many locations with these adult emergence cages. And it ranged quite a bit from the first one to the last one, but the average emergence period was 25 days. It's a really long window and it creates a really spread out bell curve, and that's really unfortunate because what we were hoping and maybe what we were expecting is to have a very narrow window, 3 to 5 days when midges come out of the ground, and it would provide a target for us to try and suppress those midges as they're trying to find currently growing soybean. The emergence window is a little bit longer than it was for 2019, which was 16 days. So there's a lot of variability in that, and that comes along with varying temperatures, moisture, soil types. There's still a lot to parse out with that, but we're still trying to understand more about the window of emergence for overwintering adults. But the long window does pose some challenges for trying to hit that overwintering movement into new soybean for us. And I'll explain that a little bit later. Here's an example of one field in particular in East Central Nebraska where they monitored with these emergence cages over different points of the season. And on the left there are the orange, and what Justin McMecken, my colleague at Nebraska, would say would be the overwintering generation. So many days adults are coming out over time. And the unfortunate part is that first and second generation, which we believe there would be 3 generations in a summer, are overlapping. So you almost have continuous adult emergence over a 3-month period of time. This does, again, pose some challenges because as we're trying to target adults with, say, a foliar insecticide program, you have adults that are constantly coming out, and so the window of timing for an application becomes much more challenging. A second research question that we're asking, in addition to some of the basic biology, is looking at natural forms of tolerance or resistance through a host plant resistance germplasm screen. So there's a soybean breeder at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln who has access to what I would call ancient soybean genetics from Asia. And this is the same screening process that I went through 15 plus years ago when we were looking at host plant resistant genes for soybean aphid. So he picked out basically a wide spectrum of soybean genetics, and I'm not a soybean breeder, but I got to see a lot of funky looking soybean plants this year. They are not anything that we would consider modern for farmers right now, but just looking at different types of genetics to see if any of them are more tolerant or resistant to midges. And so this summer we planted almost 800 different lines at Nebraska and in Iowa. And what we found is that most of them did not do very well. Most of them were able to be infested by soybean gall midge, and they didn't make it to the end of the season. And there's a lot of environmental factors that go into that too. But in Nebraska, they found 18 genetics that were considered clean or not impacted by midges. We weren't as lucky in Iowa. We found about 12. And so this is a process that's going to be going on for a long time. We're going to be doing genetic screenings and hopefully finding some winners that can be put into modern genetics over time. So this is a process that's going to go on for a long time. It's through naturally breeding programs, and so it's a slower process. But hopefully in a few years we'll be able to have a few genes in modern soybean lines. And then a third project that I'm excited to talk about is trying to understand the injury potential of soybean gallmidge, and ultimately can we predict yield losses that occur from various levels of midge infestations. And so what I propose to do is develop an injury score that's a 0 to 3. If you're familiar at all with the node injury rating that we use for corn rootworm, it's a similar process. A certain node injury score relates to a certain amount of yield loss at the end of the season. Again, I'm hoping to do this for soybean gallmidge as well. So the 0 score would be no visible injury. A score of a 1 would be at least 25% of the plants are infested. A score of a 2 would be at least 50% of the plants are infested. And then a score of a 3 is at least 75% of the plants infested. And again, I'm hoping this provides some predictive value because a lot of the infestations can start in June and then move through July and August. And so if you're on the fence about treatment costs or management options, return on investment, I'm hoping that I'd be able to provide some predictive value on whether or not a treatment would be worth it. So I have a graduate student, Mitchell Helton, that is working on developing a model for injury and yield loss. And so I won't go into the details of this regression model, but what I can say is that we've had over 550 observations or data points where we assessed treatments on 0 to 3 rating on a weekly basis, and we also took yield on those different treatments. And so we did this in 2019 and 20, and you can see the results of this preliminary model right now. And what it shows is based on historical yield, that's what we're assessing to be the max, how much can yield be reduced if you have various injury scores. And I hope that with this accumulating data from 2019 that we'll develop a model that becomes predictive value for people starting in 2021. So I'll have more to share on that as we approach the 2021 growing season. And then lastly, a fourth research project in which I probably get the most questions about is can we control soybean gallmidge with chemicals or insecticides? And I have an efficacy evaluation that I've had now for 2 years, and I have colleagues in Nebraska and Minnesota and also South Dakota that are running their own efficacy evaluations. So the treatments are variable, of course, between state to state and year to year. But I looked at a couple different insecticidal groups. I looked at different timings, early vegetative and mid-vegetative. I also looked at a variety of application sites. So we were using insecticidal seed treatments, in-furrow applications, and also foliar applications. We were using the 0 to 3 injury score at 2019 and 2020 to assess those treatments, and then of course taking yield to compare those treatments at the end of the season. What I can say is that the injury was highly variable between location. Even within the 2 Iowa locations, the injury was variable. And overall, the injury was less, the infestations were less in Iowa in 2020 compared to 2019. And sort of the flip-flop happened in Nebraska. Their injury was much more intense, much more severe, and they had a lot of dead plants at the end of the season. So I'm not sure if it's going to be sort of a cyclic pest where every year or every other year you could have highly variable infestations, kind of like we see for soybean aphid in some locations. But what I wanted to do is kind of share some of those preliminary results. And they are available in an insecticide efficacy publication that I put out every year. It's called a Yellow Book, and so you'd be able to download that at the extension store starting in December. And so that gives you all the details. If you're super into nozzle types, rates, volume, application dates, all that. And I actually looked at quite a few treatments this year with different industry companies. A lot of them were early in the pipeline or not for commercial use yet. And so the treatments that I'm showing you now are the ones that I got approved to share, but know that I am looking at some more preliminary type of insecticide groups in the background. Hopefully I can share that eventually with some approvals. But I did had a couple of seed treatments, and then early vegetative and mid-vegetative applications of foliar insecticides. And what I can generally say is, if you look at this example on the right, this is treatments that we had in southwest Iowa near Griswold, and you can see that the injury wasn't that fantastic. Most of the scores were around a 0.5 or a 1. So if you think back to that injury score, that's less than 25% of the plants that were infested. And there's a lot of overlap between the untreated control, seed treatments, and foliar insecticides. And so I didn't see any strong trends with comparing insecticidal groups, any strong trends with seed treatments versus foliars, and now this is the second year that I've seen this trend. Unfortunately, we didn't see anything that worked better than doing nothing at all. What I will say is that in Nebraska, where they had much higher infestation levels, so they had many treatments that scored around 2 or 3, they did see some more yield protection with insecticidal seed treatments. And they also saw a benefit of using thiamate in Nebraska, and also through some on-farm research through the Iowa Soybean Association with Scott Nilsson. What they did is, if you know about thiamate, it's usually applied with a smart box, and usually the target insect is corn rootworm. But of course, we're interested in trying everything, and I used thiamate as well. I did not see an impact or any type of yield protection with it, but some other trials did. So that's going to be ongoing as well. Because I did not see high infestation levels and high numbers of dead and dying plants, I did not see a lot of differences between yield at the end of the season. And this goes along with almost everything. If you don't have enough insect pressure, I do not expect to see differences between treatments. And so this is the yield results for these treatments. Again, the untreated control, it had about the same yield as a seed treatment or a foliar application. So this is disappointing because I think in part we have a long window of emergence for the adults, and so the timing is really difficult to get right. And I don't expect most of these products to target larvae that are feeding on the inside of the plant. So again, we're continuing to look at more systemic products that will target or get access to the larvae on the inside of the plant. But right now, we are not seeing any silver bullets for timing or foliar applications. I wanted to make you aware of a couple things that are happening for soybean gall midge because it is a regional issue. We have created what's called the Soybean Gall Midge Alert Network, and you can see the website there. And we're putting weekly updates during the growing season of what's happening, especially with the adult emergence that we're confirming at those many, many locations to kind of give you a heads up what's happening around your area. And you can get that as a text message, a phone call, you can get it through an email, or you don't have to sign up for any notifications if you don't want to. You could just visit the site. We have contact information for those states that are currently affected by soybean gall midge, and we're going to update as we have new detections in counties for further growing seasons. But what I did want to also share is that we are putting together a sort of an informal brown bag series in January, in which it's free to join. You can ask questions. We're going to have some more data that's coming out of the 2020 season. And those 3 dates are all in January, the 5th, the 12th, and the 19th. And so I'll be speaking a bit, but then you'll also get to hear from entomologists in surrounding states too, to get their perspectives on what they saw and what they were able to do for research this summer. So I encourage you to attend if you can. So big takeaway points that I hope that I made and that you can think about for the next couple of growing season is that soybean gall midge is a significant pest, and the yield impacts are quite severe when you have high infestations. It's the presence in 2020 was highly variable. It was maybe overall down a bit in western Iowa compared to 2019. But on the other hand, Nebraska probably had its worst season yet. So it's a pest that we still have a lot to learn about as far as distribution and infestation intensity. So if you have it, I think you're probably pretty familiar with what it looks like. But if you are on one of those edges of a county that hasn't had any positive detections yet, I encourage you to scout and start at the field edge, and especially where soybean was growing last year. I think that'll be your best bet and your best use of time. We found out that the adult emergence is very long, which makes management very difficult, but I continued to scout even through August to see if you have plants that get infested. We had some preliminary research looking at host plant resistance and other cultural control, and then also an efficacy evaluation. And a lot of that is still ongoing, and I kind of showed you the highlights of what we came up with for summaries in 2020. And what we're recommending for people is if you do have areas that are highly infested, you have some dead and lodged plants, if there's any way to harvest the perimeter first to save those plants before they fall down, it would be an advantage to do so versus maybe some of those fields that aren't infested yet, is to target those edges first. Okay, it is time to switch gears. I'm going to pass the baton to my colleague Ashley Dean, and we're going to be talking about an old pest, soybean aphid. So thanks for watching.
Hi, like Erin said, my name is Ashley Dean, and I am also an extension entomologist with ISU Extension. And I'm really excited to share with you today some of the work that I did during my master's degree. So it'll be a little bit different from the normal soybean pest updates that we share, but what we're going to highlight today is a model that we created to predict yield and revenue based on management decisions for soybean aphid. And we did this by compiling economic information from 2018, along with all of the information that we know today about soybean aphid. We created realistic scenarios for soybean aphid in Iowa, and we modeled them and compared them over the probability of an aphid outbreak occurring, but also included the probability that aphids are resistant to pyrethroid insecticides. So you might be wondering why we used probabilities for this analysis. And it's because soybean aphid is a sporadic pest, so it is impossible to know in a particular year if soybean aphid will occur at a particular location. So luckily for us, soybean aphid insecticide efficacy evaluations have been ongoing in Iowa since 2007, and essentially we have been able to track whether an aphid outbreak occurred at those locations in the years that we did the evaluations. And you can see from the graph that the aphid populations are quite variable year to year and location to location. So we determined that an outbreak occurred anytime the economic threshold was exceeded, and the frequency of that as of 2018 was 43.5% across high-risk areas in Iowa. And those high-risk areas are generally in the northern 2/3 of the state. We also know that soybean aphid can reduce yield, and the literature tells us that that can be as high as 50%. And we've noticed in the efficacy evaluations that this is also quite variable, and you can tell from the graph that this is variable year to year and also field to field. And what we found is that the average yield loss as of 2018 was 12.7% across these high-risk areas in Iowa. So we assumed for our model that that would be representative of those high-risk areas. Luckily, multiple management tactics exist for soybean aphid. So the one that most people are familiar with and the most common management tactic is insecticide application, which has typically been through the use of pyrethroids and organophosphates. Another lesser-known tactic is host plant resistance. It is pretty limited in availability, but it is available for farmers to utilize in Iowa. What's great is that these tactics are equal in terms of yield protection when outbreaks do occur. And so we did a field study in 2016 and 2017 to compare insecticides and host plant resistance. And so that's what this graph shows. And you can tell that sometimes host plant resistance, which are the yellow bars in this graph, are actually numerically better than insecticide applications. So this is true as long as aphids are susceptible to the insecticide. If aphids are resistant to the insecticide, yield might be compromised. We know that pyrethroid-resistant aphids are increasing in the Midwest and also in Iowa, and we only expect this to worsen over time. A graduate student in Erin and also Matt O'Neill's lab, Evira valmorbida, is working on this research. So he went to 3 different locations in Iowa in 2019. he collected some aphids from the field, brought them back to the lab, and determined that there was some level of resistance in all 3 populations. Then he would spray a pyrethroid in that same area, go back a few days later to collect any survivors, took them back to the lab, and he determined that after just 1 application of a pyrethroid, there was a 75% increase in the frequency of resistance alleles. And so essentially all of the aphids left in that area after the insecticide application were pyrethroid resistant individuals. And ultimately, we know that management decisions affect yield and revenue for farmers, and this can be especially true when aphids are resistant to a management tactic such as pyrethroids. So I mentioned earlier that we developed management scenarios for soybean aphid in Iowa, and we can compare them using our model. So first, we will talk about the outcome of the model when aphids are not resistant to pyrethroids. So we will compare the expected net revenue of 3 management scenarios today. So the first one is no management, which is the black line, host plant resistance, which is the blue line, and an insecticide application, which is the orange line. And what we found is that host plant resistance offers the greatest revenue overall, and this is because these varieties do not experience yield loss when an outbreak occurs, and they also have less input costs. And so this is true for all of the scenarios that I'll talk about, so I'll only mention host plant resistance when something new comes up. What we also found was that an insecticide pays off when the chance of an outbreak is at least 29%. And recall that the probability of an outbreak in high-risk areas of Iowa is 43.5%. So that tells us that most of the time farmers would expect that an insecticide would pay off in terms of management. So now we'll switch gears and talk about the outcomes of the model when aphids are resistant to the pyrethroid. So all of the following graphs will talk about the probability of resistant aphids. So here we find that the benefit of host plant resistance is even greater when aphids are resistant to the alternative management tactic. We also find that pyrethroid use is more profitable than no management until the chance of resistance is around 50%. And this stood out to us because what this tells us is that most of the time farmers would not be experiencing any financial consequences of using a pyrethroid on pyrethroid-resistant aphids, and ultimately that would contribute to the proliferation of insecticide resistance in the population. So then we wanted to take it a step further and think about what might happen if farmers actually scouted after they made a pyrethroid application and noticed that there were survivors left. So we thought that a farmer might decide to go back to the field and make another application with a different mode of action, such as an organophosphate. And let's assume that yield loss is protected with this second application. So that's what the green line now represents. And what we found is that there's really no financial benefit of that second insecticide application, even though it protects yield. So ultimately, farmers would have been better off not managing the aphids at all, or even just leaving it at just the pyrethroid application and accepting the yield loss. And then we wanted to think about what if farmers expect that there are pyrethroid-resistant individuals in the population, so they just don't spray a pyrethroid at all. So the first scenario with that is, what if they just sprayed an organophosphate only? So now the green line represents that scenario. And what we find is that an organophosphate is always better than not managing the aphids at all, and it's better than a pyrethroid when the chance of insecticide resistance is at least 13%. So the last scenario that we looked at is if farmers were to use sulfoxaflor, which is a newer insecticide that is a bit more selective for phloem-feeding insects, and typically comes with a higher price tag than the other two that we've talked about today. And what we found is that although sulfoxaflor was better than a pyrethroid when the chance of resistance is at least 75%, sulfoxaflor was never more profitable than not managing the aphids at all. And this result is likely highly dependent on the cost of sulfoxaflor and whether or not it would become more affordable in the future. Some final takeaway thoughts for our modeling exercise and what we know about soybean aphid today is that soybean aphid will be more challenging and expensive to manage in the future, especially with small profit margins for soybean in the Midwest. And likely you all probably already know about that. So consider host plant resistant varieties if they fit into your operation. So if you're already not using herbicide tolerant varieties, host plant resistance might be a good option for you if you experience aphid outbreaks. And then maybe if you are thinking of switching away from herbicide tolerant varieties for some other reason and you experience aphid outbreaks, host plant resistance would be a good option. Of course, scouting during the growing season will enhance decision making and actually take away a lot of the uncertainty associated with the modeling outcomes that we just talked about. Because if you're scouting, then you know whether an aphid outbreak is occurring or not. And then the probabilities that you would be dealing with in our model would be 0 or 100%. And then you could make your comparisons that way. And of course, scouting post-spray is important to determine if there are survivors. So we know that there is some level of pyrethroid resistance in the aphid population, and it's impossible to know in a particular year where those will fall and if they'll be in your field or not. But if you make a pyrethroid application and then scout, you'll be able to know if there are any survivors and if you need to make another application. It's also important to remember that insecticide options are pretty limited. So there are a few newer chemistries available that are a bit more selective for phloem-feeding insects, and usually they come at a higher price than some of the others. But they can be used as a good tool for resistance management, and resistance management will be key to profitable soybean production in the future. And lastly, we just want to make sure to consider the economics of management options and make sure that they fit into your operation. So it's pretty simple to build a budget like we did for this analysis. And there are actually soybean budgets available through ISU Extension and likely through other state extension services. And they can be used as a baseline for estimating costs. The ones at ISU do not include insecticide application for soybean, but you could easily include any insecticide applications that you would make. And ultimately, we want to make sure that management options that farmers choose are contributing to profitability for farmers. So evaluating decisions and especially the financial aspect of those decisions is very important. So lastly, we just wanted to show this decision-making chart for soybean aphid, and it really is a visual representation of what we kind of stepped through in our modeling analysis. So the three main things are to scout to determine that soybean aphid is present, and then if there is an outbreak occurring, you would need to make some management decisions, whether you want to manage the aphids or not. And lastly, if you make the decision to treat, you would want to think about whether or not you suspect pyrethroid resistance in the population. And if the answer to that is no, you can use essentially any insecticide that you wish. And if the answer is yes, then you would have to be more selective to make sure that you don't use a pyrethroid and contribute more to pyrethroid resistance. And so this is part of a publication in the Journal of Integrated Pest Management that you could go find and find this decision-making framework if you would like to use it to make decisions for your operation. We just wanted to thank the following funding sources that helped us with aphids and midges. And we wanted to also thank our lab team for helping collect all of the data that we showed you for this summer. And we would be happy to answer any questions that you might have at this time.